For months, the area behind Nancy Guthrie's Tucson home has been one of those places investigators have already searched, walked through, and looked over carefully. So when neighbors recently reported seeing FBI agents back there again, more than 6 months after Nancy disappeared, people naturally began asking why. The agents were reportedly not simply passing through the neighborhood. They were seen in the rough, open area behind Nancy's property, along a narrow dirt path surrounded by desert vegetation and uneven ground. And that detail matters because this is not the first time investigators have looked closely at the area. The FBI was there in the early days of the investigation. Now they are back. According to reporting from Brian Enton, neighbors told him that FBI teams had returned to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood in recent weeks. One neighbor reportedly saw an FBI agent in the area behind Nancy's house, where an alley-like dirt path runs through the desert terrain. Before we go any further, if you've been following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance and you want updates based on what investigators actually confirm, consider subscribing to the channel. We're going to keep following the details carefully, without turning every rumor into a fact. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, do you think investigators returning to the area behind Nancy's home could mean they received new information? Or do you think they are simply taking another look at an area they searched before? Stay with me, because the reason that particular location matters becomes much clearer when we look back at what investigators were doing in Nancy's neighborhood from the very beginning. When federal investigators return to a specific piece of ground months after a disappearance, it raises a reasonable question. What are they looking for now that they did not find before? Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old when she disappeared from her Tucson home. She was last known to be at home on January 31st, 2026, and she was reported missing the following day. Investigators have said they believe she was taken against her will. Blood found on the porch was later identified as Nancy's. From the beginning, the investigation centered heavily on the neighborhood around her home. That makes sense when you consider the setting. Nancy lived in the Catalina foothills, where homes can sit apart from one another, streets can wind through the desert, and thick vegetation, rocks and washes can create pockets that are difficult to see from the road. There are also no conventional streetlights in parts of the neighborhood because of local light pollution rules. At night, that can make the landscape remarkably dark. And in a case where investigators have been trying to determine exactly how someone could approach a home, remove an elderly woman, and leave without being clearly captured on surveillance, every possible route matters. Back in February, federal agents and local investigators were already moving through the area. Neighbors were questioned about security cameras. They were asked about vehicles. They were asked whether they had seen anything unusual around the night Nancy disappeared. One neighbor, Ann Adams, later described to the Associated Press how agents asked specifically about January 31 and the morning of February 1. They wanted to know whether residents had seen anything suspicious on their cameras. That tells us something important about the early investigation. The FBI was not simply concentrating on Nancy's front door. They were trying to understand the wider neighborhood. Who had been there? Which vehicles had passed through? What cameras had captured? And perhaps most importantly, were there ways in or out that investigators had not initially understood? Then came the surveillance images. The FBI eventually released images and video showing a masked person outside Nancy's home on the night she disappeared. The person appeared to be wearing dark clothing, a mask and gloves, carrying a backpack, and possibly wearing a gun holster. Investigators said the footage came from residual data recovered from the camera system. That footage gave investigators something concrete to work with, but it did not answer the most basic question. Where did that person go? The surrounding terrain became important. Investigators searched roads, washes, and pull-offs between Nancy's home and major roads leading out of Tucson. They also examined nearby neighborhoods and gathered surveillance from surrounding businesses and residences. And now, months later, attention has reportedly returned to the ground behind Nancy's home. This time, there is another factor investigators may have to consider. Arizona's monsoon season. Heavy summer rain can change desert terrain. Water can move loose soil, expose objects that had been covered, and alter washes and drainage areas. A retired sheriff's lieutenant cited in recent reporting suggested that the rains could potentially have exposed or moved evidence near Nancy's home. That does not mean the FBI has found anything. It does not mean Nancy's remains are there. And it certainly does not establish that the person seen in the original surveillance footage entered or left through the back of the property. Those details remain unknown. But investigators returning to the same area after months of weather and additional investigative work is enough to make people take notice, because there is another possibility. Perhaps something they already knew about the area has taken on new significance. Sometimes an investigation does not uncover a completely new clue. Sometimes an old detail becomes important only after investigators understand something else. A camera image can look ordinary until a vehicle is identified. A person walking through a neighborhood can seem unimportant until a timeline is reconstructed. A dirt path behind a house can look like nothing more than desert terrain until investigators begin asking whether it could have provided another way into or out of the property. And Nancy's case has already shown how much can depend on small pieces of information. Her disappearance has now stretched across more than 6 months, with no public resolution. The family has continued waiting. The community has continued watching, and investigators have continued working the case, even as public attention has moved in different directions. That is why the sighting reported by neighbors behind Nancy's home stands out. The FBI has been there before. They know the area. They know the terrain. They know what they were looking for during the initial searches. So why return now? Is the Bureau simply conducting another sweep because new information requires them to double-check the area? Could the monsoon rains have changed the ground enough to make another search worthwhile? Or has some piece of information brought investigators back to a location they thought they had already exhausted? For now, there is no official answer, but the fact that federal agents are reportedly once again working the ground behind Nancy Guthrie's home has reopened a question that has been hanging over this investigation since the beginning. Did investigators miss something in the neighborhood the first time they searched it? Before we move into the next part, I'd really like to hear from those of you who have been following this case from the beginning. When you first heard that investigators were reportedly back in the area behind Nancy's home, what was your first thought? Do you think they may have received a new lead? Or could the changing desert landscape have given investigators a reason to search the area again? Leave your thoughts below, and if you haven't subscribed yet, consider joining us here at Hidden Motive. We'll continue separating what investigators have actually confirmed from what people are simply speculating about online. Because there is another detail about the neighborhood that makes this renewed attention even more interesting. The most important thing to understand about this renewed activity is that investigators have not publicly said they found Nancy Guthrie behind her home. They have not announced a new suspect. They have not said that the person seen on surveillance was located. What we have is something more limited, but still worth paying attention to. Neighbors reporting that FBI agents have returned to an area they know extremely well, and that area has always presented investigators with a difficult problem. Nancy's home sits in the Catalina foothills, where roads wind through the neighborhood and desert vegetation can make the distance between properties feel much larger than it really is. There are houses, walls, trees, rocks, brush, and open patches of land. From one street, you may not immediately see what is happening, only a short distance away. That is why investigators have spent so much time trying to understand how Nancy's abductor could have approached the property and then disappeared. The FBI itself released surveillance footage showing an armed individual apparently tampering with the camera at Nancy's front door during the early morning hours of January 31st. According to the FBI, the person appeared to be armed and was wearing clothing that made identification difficult. That footage gave investigators an important starting point, but it created another problem. The camera showed what happened at the front of the home. It did not explain the entire route. Investigators still had to determine where the person came from, where that person went afterward, and whether someone else was waiting nearby. And that is where the surrounding neighborhood becomes important. Earlier in the investigation, agents were already asking residents about their security cameras and checking footage from different dates. One report described FBI investigators sitting with a neighbor and reviewing home security video for specific nights, searching for anything that might have looked unusual. That tells us that investigators were not simply looking at January 31. They were studying patterns. They wanted to know whether someone had been watching Nancy's home before the night she disappeared. That possibility has always been one of the troubling questions in this case. Was Nancy targeted suddenly? Or had someone been paying attention to her routine? The difference between those two possibilities is enormous. If someone had been watching the house, investigators would want to know when that surveillance began. They would want to know whether a strange vehicle appeared repeatedly. They would want to know whether someone walked through the neighborhood on earlier nights. They would want to know whether the person responsible knew the roads and pathways well enough to avoid being noticed. And that brings us back to the area behind Nancy's house. According to neighbors who spoke with Brian Enton, FBI teams were reportedly back in the neighborhood in the weeks leading up to August 10th, with at least one neighbor saying she saw an agent in the area behind Nancy's property. Enton described a narrow, alley-like dirt path running behind the home. That report came with an important caveat. A spokesperson for the Pima County Sheriff's Department told Fox News Digital that no task force investigators had recently returned to the area, while the neighbor said she recognized people from earlier law enforcement activity and believed she had seen the FBI there again. The FBI itself did not immediately comment to Fox News. So we have conflicting pieces of information. That needs to be said clearly. The neighbor's account is not the same thing as an official confirmation from investigators, but the report was significant enough that it prompted renewed discussion about why the area might deserve another look. One explanation comes from the environment itself. Summer in southern Arizona can bring powerful monsoon storms. Heavy rain can turn normally dry washes into moving streams. Water can push soil, branches, and debris into new positions. Something that was partially covered months earlier can become visible, while something sitting on the surface can be moved somewhere else. Former Pima County Sheriff's Lieutenant Bob Krygier suggested that environmental changes could be one reason investigators would revisit an area. Think about what that means in practical terms. Imagine a small object lying beneath loose desert soil. During the first search, nobody sees it. Then months pass. Rain comes. The ground shifts. The object becomes exposed. Investigators return. They may not be searching because they suddenly know exactly where something is. They may simply know that conditions have changed enough to make another search worthwhile. That is a very different explanation from the dramatic theories spreading online. And it is important not to confuse the two. There has been plenty of speculation about Nancy's whereabouts, especially after reports that agents were seen again behind the property. Some people have interpreted the renewed activity as evidence that Nancy must still be somewhere nearby, but there is no public evidence establishing that. Investigators could be looking for physical evidence. They could be checking a route. They could be following up on information that has never been made public. They could be eliminating a possibility, or they could simply be making sure an area previously searched has not changed. Any one of those explanations is possible. Then there is another development that shows just how difficult this case has become. In August, human remains were discovered in a desert area roughly 15 miles from Nancy's home. For a moment, that discovery naturally raised concern. After all, Nancy had been missing for more than 6 months. But authorities later said the remains were not connected to her disappearance and appeared to have been there for an extended period. That meant investigators were still facing the same central problem. Nancy had disappeared. The surveillance footage existed. There were ransom notes. There were searches. There were tips. But there was still no confirmed location for Nancy and no publicly identified suspect. And that makes every new search around her home more significant, because investigators are still trying to close the gap between what they know and what they cannot explain. There is another reason the back of the property deserves attention. It may provide a completely different perspective of the neighborhood. From the front, Nancy's house is one property among many. From behind, the terrain opens into a different network of brush, paths, and neighboring properties. Someone trying to avoid the main road might have considered such an area useful. Again, that does not prove that Nancy's abductor used it. It simply explains why investigators would be interested in understanding every possible route. And there is something else worth remembering. The FBI has already demonstrated that it is willing to return to details that seemed ordinary at first. The door camera footage became important. The surrounding surveillance became important. The ransom notes became important. And now, according to neighbors, agents are reportedly taking another look at the terrain behind Nancy's home. That does not tell us what they have found. But it does tell us the investigation has not simply been abandoned. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has repeatedly maintained that the case remains active and that investigators are continuing to pursue leads. For Nancy's family, that may be one of the few things they can hold on to. Because after 6 months, waiting becomes its own kind of hardship. Every reported sighting brings hope. Every search raises questions. And every time investigators return to Nancy's neighborhood, people naturally wonder whether this time they may have noticed something that was overlooked before. But there is still one question hanging over all of it. If the FBI really is concentrating on that narrow stretch of land behind Nancy's home, what brought them back there now? At this point, I want to pause for a moment and ask you something. If you were investigating this case, would you search the area behind Nancy's home again? We know investigators have already spent time examining the neighborhood. We also know that months have passed, the terrain has changed, and additional information may have become available. So I'd genuinely like to know what you think. And if you're watching from somewhere outside Tucson, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. This case has drawn attention from people far beyond Nancy's own community, and it's remarkable to see how many people are still hoping for answers. If you appreciate this kind of careful, long-form coverage, subscribe before we continue. Because in the final part, we're going to step back from the speculation and look at what this renewed attention to Nancy's neighborhood could actually mean. And just as importantly, what it does not prove. That question brings us to the most important point in this entire development. The FBI returning to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood does not, by itself, tell us what investigators believe happened to her. It does not confirm that Nancy is nearby. It does not confirm that investigators have found new physical evidence. And it does not mean that a suspect has suddenly been identified. What it does show is that the area around Nancy's home remains important enough to examine again. After more than 6 months, that matters. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson home in the early morning hours of January 31, 2026. The evidence investigators have publicly discussed paints a troubling picture. There was blood on the porch. There was surveillance footage showing a masked individual outside the home. The person appeared to be prepared, with dark clothing, gloves, a mask, and what investigators described as a gun holster. And then Nancy was gone. Those facts have never received a simple explanation. Investigators have spent months trying to reconstruct those early morning hours. They have looked at Nancy's home. They have looked at surrounding properties. They have collected surveillance footage. They have spoken with neighbors. They have searched areas around Tucson. They have followed tips. And now, according to neighbors, federal investigators have once again been seen in the area behind Nancy's property. There are several reasonable explanations for that. The first is that investigators received information that directed them back toward the neighborhood. That information could come from a witness. It could come from surveillance. It could come from a forensic development. Or it could come from something that has never been made public. Investigators often keep details private, precisely because releasing them could interfere with the case. The second possibility is much more straightforward. The desert landscape has changed. The summer monsoon season has brought rain into an environment where the ground can shift quickly. A place searched in February may not look exactly the same months later. A drainage area can change. Loose soil can move. Brush can be disturbed. Objects can become exposed. That is why a second search does not necessarily mean the first one was done poorly. Sometimes circumstances change. Sometimes technology changes. And sometimes investigators simply have more information than they had during the first search. That last possibility may be the most important. Think about what investigators knew on February 1 compared with what they may know today. On the day Nancy was reported missing, they were dealing with a rapidly developing situation. They had to secure the home, determine whether Nancy had left voluntarily, preserve physical evidence, collect surveillance, interview neighbors, identify vehicles, and establish a timeline. 6 months later, investigators have had time to study thousands of pieces of information. A vehicle that initially appeared insignificant may now be relevant. A face captured on a distant camera may now be compared with other evidence. A movement through the neighborhood may make more sense after investigators reconstruct the timeline. That is how investigations evolve, and Nancy's case has had more than its share of unanswered questions. One of the biggest is how the person captured outside her home got away. The surveillance footage gave investigators an image, but an image is not the same thing as an identification. And seeing someone outside a house does not automatically reveal where that person came from or where that person went. The neighborhood itself could hold part of that answer. That is why the reported focus on the back of Nancy's home is worth watching, while still keeping the facts separate from speculation. There is also a human side to this that can easily get lost. For Nancy's neighbors, this has not been an abstract mystery happening somewhere far away. This happened on their streets. It happened near their homes. Some of them were questioned. Some checked their security cameras. Some watched investigators come and go. And months later, they are still seeing activity connected to the case. One neighbor described the area behind Nancy's home as an alley-like dirt path. It may not look important to someone seeing it for the first time, but investigators are trained to look at places differently. They ask how a person could move through an area without being seen. They look for footprints, tire tracks, disturbed vegetation, and potential lines of sight. They consider whether a vehicle could stop nearby without attracting attention. They look at where cameras can and cannot see, and they try to understand what a person could have known about the area before ever approaching the home. None of that proves what happened to Nancy, but it explains why a seemingly ordinary patch of desert can become important in a missing person investigation. There was also another moment this summer that briefly drew attention away from Nancy's neighborhood. Human remains were found about 15 miles from her home. Naturally, people wondered whether the discovery might finally answer the question of where Nancy was. Authorities later said the remains were not connected to her case. That meant the investigation continued. And perhaps that is the hardest part for Nancy's family. There have been developments. There have been searches. There have been tips. There have been images released by the FBI. There have been moments when people thought an answer might be close. But Nancy herself has still not been found. For an elderly woman who simply disappeared from her own home, that uncertainty is devastating. Her family has continued to ask for information. The FBI has continued to seek leads, and the reward connected to information leading to Nancy's recovery and the identification and arrest of those responsible has remained part of the effort to bring the case closer to an answer. So where does the reported return to the neighborhood leave us? For now, with more questions than answers, we should be careful about saying that investigators have discovered something behind Nancy's home when they have not publicly confirmed such a discovery. We should also be careful about saying that the back of the property was definitely used by Nancy's abductor. That has not been established, but we can say something else with confidence. The area around Nancy's home remains relevant to investigators. And if federal agents are indeed returning to that specific section of the neighborhood, there is a reason for the renewed attention, even if that reason has not yet been disclosed. Maybe it is environmental. Maybe it is investigative. Maybe it is a new lead. Maybe it is simply a second look at an old possibility. Until authorities explain more, we do not know. And that is where this case stands today. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for months. Her family is still waiting. Investigators are still working. And the desert behind her home still holds a piece of a story that has never been completely explained. Perhaps the next answer will come from a camera. Perhaps from a witness who remembers something differently. Perhaps from physical evidence that was impossible to see months ago. Or perhaps from information someone has been holding on to since the night Nancy disappeared. If you have been following Nancy's case, I want to know what you think. Do you believe investigators are returning to the neighborhood because of new information? Or could the changing desert terrain simply be giving them another opportunity to search? And if you want to stay updated as this investigation develops, make sure you subscribe to Hidden Motive. Because the most important development may not be the fact that investigators returned. It may be what they found when they got there. Before you leave, I want to ask you one final question. After everything we've discussed, what do you think brought investigators back to the area behind Nancy Guthrie's home? Do you believe it could be connected to new information? Do you think investigators simply wanted another look at the area after the monsoon rains? Or do you think there is still something about Nancy's disappearance that investigators have not made public? There may not be enough information yet to answer that question with certainty, and that's exactly why I'd like to hear your thoughts. Leave your opinion in the comments. but please keep the conversation respectful. Behind every headline is a family that is still waiting for answers. And if you've been following Nancy's story with us, thank you. If you're new here, subscribe to Hidden Motive so you don't miss the next verified development. We'll continue following this investigation as new information becomes available, and we'll keep separating what is confirmed from what is simply being discussed online. Because in a case like Nancy's, sometimes the smallest confirmed detail can become the piece that finally helps everything else make sense.